Okay, so are you ready to dive deep into communication?
Always ready to talk about communication.
I think this is something that everybody struggles with from time to time.
Yeah, for sure. It's one of those things where, it's so integral to, every part of our lives.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's something that we really get a lot of explicit teaching on.
No.
So much of it we kind of pick up through osmosis and by observing. But, we're diving deep today into the art of effective communication in relationships. And I think it's going to give us a lot of good stuff to chew on. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. I feel like anytime I get to look at something with a fresh perspective, I always take away something useful.
Yeah, totally.
So let's get into it. What are some of the big ideas? Where do we even start with something like communication? It feels so broad.
Yeah. So I think it's helpful to think about communication as a skill.
Okay.
And that might seem kind of obvious, but I think a lot of times we treat it as something that should just come naturally. But just like any skill, it requires, practice and intention and awareness. And, there are different components to it. So one of the most fundamental things is understanding your own communication style.
Okay.
So how do you tend to communicate? Are you someone who's very direct?
Uh-huh.
Or are you someone who's more indirect?
Mm-hmm.
Do you like to get right to the point? Or do you beat around the bush a little bit?
Mm-hmm.
And there's no right or wrong answer here. Different styles can be effective in different situations. But the key is being aware of your own tendencies and how they might be impacting your interactions with others.
So how do we know what our communication style is?
Well, I think one way is to just start paying attention to how people react to you.
Okay.
If you're constantly finding that people are misunderstanding you or they're getting defensive or maybe they just seem confused by what you're saying,
right,
those are some signs that maybe there's room for improvement in terms of how you're conveying your message.
So it's kind of like being self-aware, not just in what you're saying, but how other people are taking what you're saying.
Exactly. It's like stepping outside of yourself and trying to see your communication from the other person's perspective.
That's tough.
It is tough, but it's so valuable because once you understand how your communication style is landing, then you can start to make adjustments if needed.
Okay, so that's one piece of it. What else?
Okay, so once you have a better understanding of your own style, then we can start talking about some specific skills that are essential for effective communication.
Okay, yeah, lay it on me.
And one of the most important, really, the foundation of good communication is active listening.
Okay, active listening. What does that mean?
So it's more than just hearing the words that someone is saying.
Mm-hmm.
It's really about being fully present and engaged in the conversation.
Okay.
And that involved a few key things. One is paying attention, obviously, putting aside distractions like your phone or your to-do list, and really focusing on what the other person is saying.
That's hard.
It can be. It's a practice. And then another key element is withholding judgment.
Okay.
It's so easy to jump in with our own opinions and thoughts and solutions, but active listening is about creating a space where the other person feels heard and understood without feeling judged or criticized.
So it's like kind of putting your own stuff aside for a second and really focusing on what they're saying and how they're feeling.
Exactly. And then the next step is reflecting back what you hear. So this is really powerful because it shows the other person that you're not just hearing them, but you're actually trying to understand them.
Okay, so summarizing what they said.
Yeah, exactly. Or even just using a simple phrase like, it sounds like you're feeling frustrated or disappointed or excited, whatever the emotion is that you're picking up on.
Yeah.
And then the final piece of active listening is responding appropriately. So this means, asking clarifying questions if you need more information or offering support or validation.
Okay. So it's really about being present, withholding judgment, reflecting back, and responding appropriately.
That's it.
Okay. I can see how that would be foundational to any conversation, really.
Mm-hmm.
But particularly in relationships, I guess.
Absolutely. Because in relationships, we're not just trying to exchange information.
Right.
We're trying to connect on a deeper level. And active listening allows us to do that.
Okay. Yeah. That makes sense. I'm thinking about times in my own relationships where, I haven't been a great active listener. And it always ends up with more frustration and misunderstanding.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes the hardest part is catching yourself when you're not doing it.
I agree. It's a practice, for sure.
But I feel like even just being aware of it,
yeah,
having it in the back of my mind is helpful.
For sure.
Okay, so that's active listening. What's next?
All right, so the other side of the communication coin is expressing yourself clearly.
Right.
Because it's not enough to just listen. We also need to be able to articulate our own thoughts and feelings and needs effectively.
Right. Because if you're not expressing yourself, then the other person can't really understand you.
Exactly. And this can be tricky because, sometimes we're not even sure what we're feeling or what we need.
Yeah.
But it's important to take the time to reflect and figure that out, because otherwise it's like we're expecting the other person to read our minds.
Right. And that never works out well.
No, it doesn't. And so one technique that can be really helpful for expressing yourself clearly is using I statements.
Okay, I statements. I feel like I've heard of this before.
Yeah, it's a classic communication tool. And basically, it's about shifting the focus from blame to your own experience. So instead of saying, "You always interrupt me," which is kind of accusatory, you could say, "I feel frustrated when I'm interrupted because it makes me feel like my thoughts aren't valued."
Right, so it's like owning your own feelings rather than blaming the other person.
Exactly. And it's not about suppressing your feelings or pretending that you're not upset. It's just about expressing them in a way that's more likely to be heard and understood.
And that makes sense because if someone comes at me with blame, I'm going to get defensive.
For sure.
But if they're saying, "Hey, I feel like this when you do that,"
Yeah.
that's different.
Exactly. And using I statements, it takes practice. It can feel a little awkward at first.
I bet.
But the more you use them, the more natural they become. And they can really make a big difference in the tone and the effectiveness of your communication.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got active listening. We've got I statements. I feel like we're building this communication toolkit.
Absolutely.
What else do we need in there?
All right, so let's not forget about nonverbal communication.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Body language and all that stuff.
Exactly. So, our words convey information, but our nonverbal cues convey emotion.
Okay.
And they can either reinforce or completely contradict what we're saying.
Yeah, totally. You can tell someone you're not mad, but if you're crossing your arms and scowling, they're not going to believe you.
Exactly. And sometimes we're not even aware of our own nonverbal cues. So it's important to pay attention to things like our facial expressions, our body posture, our tone of voice, and make sure that they're aligned with the message that we're trying to send.
Okay, so checking in with yourself, how am I holding my body? What's my face doing? Am I raising my voice without realizing it?
Yeah, exactly. And on the flip side, it's important to be able to read other people's nonverbal cues as well.
Right, because sometimes people aren't great at expressing themselves verbally.
Exactly. And so you might need to look for those nonverbal clues to get a better sense of what they're really feeling.
So if someone says they're fine, but they look really tense or upset, you might want to probe a little deeper.
Exactly. And, it's important to remember that nonverbal communication is complex. So, a crossed arm could mean that someone's defensive.
Yeah.
But it could also just mean that they're cold.
Right. Context matters.
Exactly. So it's about looking at the whole picture, both the verbal and the nonverbal, and using your best judgment.
This is making me think about misunderstandings I've had with people, where I'm sure nonverbal communication was a factor, and I just wasn't aware of it at the time.
Yeah, I think that happens to all of us.
Okay, so we've covered a lot. We've got active listening, expressing ourselves clearly, paying attention to nonverbal cues. Where do we go from here?
Okay, well, no conversation about effective communication would be complete without talking about conflict resolution.
Ooh, conflict. Everyone's favorite topic.
Right. So here's the thing. Conflict is inevitable in any relationship, whether it's with a romantic partner, a family member, a friend, a coworker. Anytime you have two people with different perspectives and needs, there's bound to be some disagreement.
Yeah.
But the key is, how do we navigate that conflict in a healthy and productive way?
Right. Because it's easy to let conflict escalate and turn into something really destructive.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's where all of these skills that we've been talking about come into play. So first and foremost, active listening.
Okay.
When you're in conflict with someone, it's so important to really try to understand their perspective, even if you don't agree with it.
Right.
And that means, again, putting aside your own judgments and really trying to see things from their point of view.
So it's not about trying to win the argument.
No.
It's about trying to understand where they're coming from.
Exactly. And then, along with active listening, compromise is key.
Compromise.
So, conflict often arises because each person wants something different.
Right.
And so the goal is to find a solution that meets both of your needs, at least to some extent.
So it's about finding that, like, middle ground.
Yeah. And sometimes that means giving a little bit.
Yeah.
Sometimes it means letting go of your ideal outcome and finding something that's acceptable to both of you.
Right.
And, sometimes the best solution isn't a compromise at all, but a creative third option that neither of you initially considered.
Ooh, I like that.
And that's where true collaboration comes in. So instead of seeing conflict as a battle to be won, you're working together to find a solution that benefits both of you.
Okay. So it's like approaching conflict with curiosity and openness rather than, defensiveness and anger.
Exactly. And, it's not always easy.
No.
But it's so much more productive than letting conflict fester and escalate.
Yeah, that's for sure. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Communication styles, active listening, I statements, nonverbal cues, conflict resolution. I feel like I need to take notes.
Right. It's a lot.
But it's all really important stuff. And I think, just having this awareness, it's a good starting point.
I agree. And it's an ongoing process.
Mm-hmm.
Communication is something that we're constantly learning and growing in.
Right.
But the more we practice these skills, the more fulfilling and harmonious our relationships will be.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on.
Yeah.
It's not a one-time thing.
Yeah.
This is something that we're always working on.
Always.
I think that's helpful because it takes the pressure off.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be perfect every time.
Exactly.
But if we're just, striving to be better communicators, that's a win.
Absolutely.
Okay, so everyone listening, I hope you took some notes.
Yeah.
And I hope you'll, take these tools and start using them in your own lives and see what happens. Because I really think, if we can improve our communication, that's going to have a ripple effect on every aspect of our lives.
Couldn't agree more.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.
See you then.